okay with it? Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to have you here to our talk, a very important political talk on foreign affairs policies, on the global situation we are facing. And in the very end, it's the big strategic question about confrontation or cooperation on the world stage, and what are the big axes of power: China, Russia, EU, US. Only to introduce myself, I am Helga Trüpel. I was an MEP for 15 years between 2004 and 2019, and now I'm working on the think tank EU Watch and on a level of a citizens initiative dealing with European affairs in Bremen, Europa Union Bremen. I would like to introduce our experts today. It's Elmar Brok. He was for a very long time in the European Parliament and in German television and public. He was always regarded to be Mr. Europe. And he was the chairperson of the Committee of Foreign Affairs, and therefore he will start to talk and give us his analysis of what is going on and what the European Union should do, what probably have been mistakes, and what is our future task. And then with us we have Jane Kinninmont. She is a very profound lady in political analysis, and we will listen to her secondly. And then we have with us Alan Mendoza. He is a specialist and expert on foreign affairs as well. So all of you have now 5 minutes to touch upon the first big question: what about the relationship of cooperation, confrontation, what we do now, the Western democracies, towards the aggressive war of Putin? And should this be a blueprint for other regions in the world, especially the Gulf region or others? So I would like to want you to ask in the first round this big challenge, and then we hopefully have a very vivid debate, and you are all invited to come in with your special points. Please, Elmar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Helga, for this possibility. I will give you some headlines which we can discuss then later, because in 5 minutes to tell the whole story, it's a little bit difficult, but we will make it. First of all, the European Union is in a certain way a success story. We are economically strong. The European internal market is the biggest, most successful internal market of the world. We have a GNP like the United States, and we are the biggest trading power of the world. The European Union and her member states give 60% of the development aid of this world, 70%, for example, of humanitarian aid in this world. That is the question in soft power, that the European Union is very strong. But we have seen in these days again that soft power does not bring us in the table of negotiations into questions for war and peace when you have not a stick. Annalena Baerbock said rightly, someone who talks does not shoot. But we have to complete that sentence. You have to be strong enough in order to talk and to succeed for peace. So that is lacking. The European Union and its member states are too weak to play a role when it comes to hard politics, as it in this case. And this is our own fault. That is not a question of money. The European Union member states spend 3 times more money for military than Russia. But every country does it on their own. Everyone makes its own ammunition when I overdo it. We have no cooperation. The member states of the European Union have 160 weapon systems. The United States has 25 weapon systems. That is the lack of synergies. And therefore, I think we have to change totally our structures of closer European cooperation, that all our armies are together, not just in planning, but also in procurement and development of weapons. to have for less money more weapons if you do use the synergy effects. Not everyone does its own thing. We order our weapons in a pharmacy in that way, and so expensive is it. And here we have to come together. There is now possibilities on the table since the Treaty of Lisbon with PESCO and other instruments. There is now a defense budget, a small one for development in the EU budget. But that is not a question that so much has to happen on the European level, but it has to be planned together. And not everyone does it on its own. And for example, we have no possibilities between our armies to have a complete communication system. Simple things like that, not to talk about the real hardware. And here I think we have to come together. And the second point is we have to come to majority voting in foreign security and defense policy, or at least make it possible that coalitions of the willing can be active in the name of the European Union closely together. That I think is an important question. And when we have now in Germany, for example, the turnaround, the government to spend 100 billion euros for defense now, then it would be a disaster to do it in the same way as we have done it in the past. Then the money goes down the drain again. And here we have to come, that we change in Germany and in Europe, and in cooperation with Europe, the structures in all these questions in order to play a role that we are able to be a factor for peace. That the old Roman saying is, prepare for war in order to keep peace. Some truth in that, some truth, unfortunately, some truth in that. And therefore, we have to recognize this for the future, for the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elmar. That have been very clear words. So far it was too little and too late what we did, and we have to be prepared. But we have, if we invest now in new weapons and better procurement and European cooperation, we have to innovate ourselves in the way how we do it and not only repeat what we did so far. Now we come to Jane, because at least in my member state in Germany, a lot of people said, but I think it's not reduced to Germany, that they never could have imagined that Putin would start such a war, because his economic interest would not be like this. Obviously, it's not only about economic interest, but very much about imperialism and nationalistic thinking. So Jane, what is your analysis of the current situation, please?
Thank you very much, Helga and Elmar. I mean, as you say, this war has shocked many people in Europe. Clearly, it has also shocked many people in Russia. The dominant view among the Russian think tankers and journalists was that Putin was making a big show of force on the Ukrainian border, to get diplomatic concessions. But it seems very few people inside the Russian system knew what was coming. And I think there will be quite profound consequences, although they're hard to foresee, for the internal balance of power within Russia. Meanwhile, although Europeans are very shocked that there can be today an interstate war, people in the Middle East have this very different perspective because they are living with conflicts, in interstate wars, invasions, civil wars, a complex map of conflicts. In some ways, actually, what Putin has done is not unlike Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Very similar in terms of the rhetoric that Saddam used to say Kuwait is not a real country. It played on an old border dispute to justify its actions. But in that case, there was a very clear international reaction. The UN was able to act and the invasion was reversed. The occupation was ended. Today, in the Middle East, Kuwait may be the country that is most supportive of the Arab League actually taking a position to defend international law because it's had that experience itself. But unfortunately, a lot of people and elites in the Middle East are thinking, People don't react enough when this happens to us, so why should we take a clear stance? And this is very interesting. We cannot put a Cold War template onto the Middle East for two reasons. One is the conflicts are much more complicated. It's not one aggressor versus everyone else. There are many players. Sometimes they act together in one country and on opposite sides in another country. So it's complex. But also something that is quite concerning for Western countries is that those countries that are very closely aligned with the West are generally at the moment very reluctant to stand up to Russia and condemn what it's doing. And I think a lot of it is because countries in the Middle East have been living for a long time with this concern that is growing in Europe. What if the US turns inwards for the long term and it is isolated and we need to rely upon ourselves? So even the countries in the region that have been the best friends of the US, the Gulf Arab monarchies and Israel, they are nervous about how much they can rely on the US. They are quite comfortable with a multipolar world because at the end of the day, they don't want to depend totally on any one external partner. They would rather have a few friends and maybe they can play them off against each other. So generally for the Gulf Arab states, the US has been the #1 security partner, China, the growing trade partner, and then Russia has other uses. It can cooperate to keep the price of oil high sometimes. And also it can provide some weapons here and there, and it allows the Gulf rulers who are not democratic to say to the Americans, we have other friends who won't lecture us about human rights. So this multipolar world has been quite comfortable. Now the region is wondering, are they going to be pushed to choose? And so some of the regional players, they're doing something that is quite rational, which is trying to put themselves forward as potential mediators. That, say, Israel, as we saw with Prime Minister Bennett in the last 48 hours, speaking to Putin and speaking to Zelensky, they're very much trying to pursue a negotiated settlement. And I think that's really what, for Saudi Arabia and UAE, they see as desirable as well. But it's not completely comfortable for the US and Europe because so far what's coming out seems to be closer to the Russian position than the Western position. So I think that there needs to be some quite heavy engagement with these countries to say nobody wants a Cold War across the Middle East and nobody wants a Cold War to generate a hot war against the Middle East. But whatever your views about democracy, whatever your views about the West, we cannot live in a world where invasions are a legitimate way of gaining territory, because the potential for that to fuel further wars, including in the Middle East and including in Africa, is really, really high. I'll leave it there, but look forward to further discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jane. Now we come to Ellen Mendoza, and maybe you already can touch upon the big question of China being a possible moderator. What I question at the moment after Wang Li's statement on the new era of strategic era and access of Russia and China, but I'm interested, what is your assessment of that? Please, Ellen.
Well, of the China being a moderator view, yes, on that. Look, I think the Chinese are playing a very interesting game, obviously, on the Ukraine crisis. For them, whether they were aware of the specific details or not in terms of what Putin was absolutely intending to do, that much we're not certain of. But we already know that the Americans shared intelligence about what Putin was doing. They saw the troop buildups. There clearly would have been some discussions, given the closeness between the two countries, given the fact that the leaders had met even a couple of weeks beforehand, which is useful in that way as well. So clearly the links are there between the two of them, and you would have wondered therefore why China, which has this history, if you like, of not liking interventions, if you think about what the Chinese state has said its international policy is on this subject for the last umpteen years, it's don't intervene. In fact, the affairs of state should be left to their own, and it isn't the role of other countries to do that. And obviously, they're thinking of their own sort of safeguards at that point. However, set against that is, of course, the fact that there are many commonalities between what the Chinese and Russians would like to do, in the sense, if Russia is upturning the international system, well, China is very much in the league of wanting to do that as well. Of course, the Chinese want it in their favor, not necessarily the Russians' favor, but nonetheless, that's an interesting sort of line of thinking to go down. So for them, the Russian, and of course, anything that takes down the West is always a good thing for both Russia and China. And again, as a result of that, it's quite clear the Chinese aren't necessarily upset about what the Russians have been doing in the macro sense. Obviously, on the micro sense, I'm sure there is some discomfort, hence the abstentions when it's come to votes at various points. But I do also think the Chinese have used this, if you like, as a kind of sandbox experiment for what they might choose to do in the future. It is, a scarcely kept secret that the Chinese have wanted Taiwan back for many years. It's open, they've said it. And of course, there is plenty of doctrine, Chinese military doctrine, about how that might take place. It's not beyond the realm of, kind of anyone's understanding. The Chinese might be interested in seeing how this whole crisis plays out in order to, if you like, use the Russians as a game theory version of what they might one day do in Taiwan. And of course, explicitly what they're looking at is how far will the Europeans go? How far will the Americans go? How far will others go? The Japanese, for example, have got very involved. The Canadians have got very involved. So for them, it's been looking at this and seeing how far will the international community take opposition to this? Will it eventually become military, in fact? So far we have desisted from that point of view, but, perhaps a couple of atrocities down the line, that may well be the case. So for them, I think they will have been as shocked as the Russians about the speed, I think, of the global response to this in terms of sanctions and in terms of diplomatic pariah status. And they will, look at that and calculate it within their own frameworks, what they might intend to do in their own neighborhood. Now, the next question is, at what point do the Chinese then decide to exert pressure? The fascinating point about Putin's strategy is that he's essentially cutting himself off from the West, which has been always, there's always been a debate in Russia about, do we turn east or west and how do we operate and what our, kind of positioning is. But by his actions, he is basically saying, and by the actions of the Europeans and others in response, he is saying, I'm done with you. Well, that means he has to turn east. Now, there's a lot of obviously concern in Russia about China's true intentions towards Russia as well. Very sparsely inhabited country, great mineral reserves, lots of Chinese over the border. Again, there are all these fears within Russia that actually the Chinese might seek to take advantage of any situation with a weak Russia to actually grab some of Russia for themselves or something of this kind. And so it's bizarre that Putin is, kind of going and cutting himself off from the West in order to put himself, if you like, in China's power. Because if he's in bed with China economically, they've got power over him in that regard. And I just wonder at what point do the Chinese decide they're going to exert some of that power? He's cut off from there. He's continuing his crisis. Will they at some point say, right, you're going to stop now. We're going to pull the plug on you unless you stop. Now, again, that's not something China's done before, the way this has operated, but it could be something they intend to do down the line, because of course the Chinese would love to come out of this with a great diplomatic win. We are the people who stopped the war and killing. And let's be, again, frank about it. The Chinese have had a very bad press over the past years with Hong Kong, with, of course, COVID, all these issues that have, sprung from Chinese, kind of bad behavior. And now they may see an opportunity, a diplomatic win. So I think we've got to, understand their motivations. And then there may be something down the line where they do end up serving for their own purposes as mediator and trying to stop the conflict.
Thank you very much, Alan. Now we come to some more difficult current questions. You very rightly said that NATO so far refused to interfere directly in the war because it's supposed to be much too difficult, too dangerous. Yesterday and still today, we have the big fight on the question whether Poland via Ramstein in Germany is sending MiG fighters. And there was some quarrel about that and different news, what the Americans said, what the Germans said, what the Polish wanted or not. It was the clear demand of Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials that the West is doing more. Therefore, I would like to ask you all three, what is your assessment of that? What on this special question and in general, if we midterm are in a better situation of doing our own security policies in the European Union, do we have to do it anyway together with the US and NATO, because we cannot do it on our own? Please, in the same order, Elmar, Jane, and Ellen. Elmar.
Look, my first reaction was that's a good idea to send them the mix from Poland, because the Ukrainians have trained personnel for that. It can be only such types of planes. But I hear, I cannot check that, but I hear that when they fly in from Ramstein into Ukraine, it will be in the Russian Air Force will wait for them at the border. And with all that, and that might be technically and because of other reason a difficulty. And that is the reason for the reluctance to do so. That is a different thing when you send Stingers and others via the land route to Ukraine. And that's a good idea to check that again, what is the real reason against it. But if the Americans say that it's not doable, then it's a point. Probably they also fear if you do it via Ramstein, that Ramstein in such a question could be also in danger. You have to see, you have to do it with someone who is not anymore thinking in terms of costs, Mr. Putin. He has other ideas. That is the main point. We have to see that all what he has said, and that NATO encircling and genocide is all rubbish. He wants, and that is written in his essay from last summer, but he has said it before also, that he wants to build the old imperial empire, not the Soviet Union, the old imperial empire, the old colonial imperial empire. And he wants to one of the big Tsars, Ivan, Peter, Katerina, Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir. That is really the case. We should read more what dictators write and take it seriously and not think about it. It will not happen. Yeah. They will not do it. It is too expensive for them. Such people are not interested in costs. They're interested in their paranoia thinking and in their greatness in history. This makes it so dangerous. And the second point is the question of freedom. His own people do not know that their country is in war. It's forbidden to say in Russia, you go to prison and say it's war. And
but he himself calls the sanctions by the Western countries war on Russia. He himself is allowed to use it.
So and this is the question that dictators should be taken as dictators. You have to find a modus vivendi, otherwise you cannot have a peaceful world. But I will not repeat my first thinking. What Ellen said about China, I agree mostly to, but we are now in a situation that the inventors of democracy, Xi and Erdogan, at the moment the mediators. And this does not sound very nice to me. And therefore hope much more that Israel will play a positive role in this question, what I think they will do because of certain reasons in the background. And but China will let run it, so long they themselves do not come into economic problems. The whole global economy gets problems. Then China gets problems too. They have just said only 5.5% GNP increase in the next year. That would mean that if they can go even under that, that they will have internal problems in their own country with their population. And therefore, might be that the point that if the world economy is in danger, that China might interfere.
Okay. Thank you, Elmar. And now please, Jane, give us your assessment.
Thank you. I think European countries, especially France and Germany, are now taking very seriously this question of strategic autonomy, and can Europe have some kind of collective defense that is separate from NATO, because they are listening to what Mr. Trump is still saying in American politics and to what some of the more isolationist politicians in the US are saying, and they are wondering, what if another shock to European security happened in future and the US didn't care or didn't want to support it? I mean, this has come at quite an interesting time, because for years the US has been saying we want to pivot to Asia, we want to be less involved in Middle East, less involved in European security. And I suspect that although Russia has its grievances with what they see as NATO expansionism, I think they've also looked at what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and concluded at this time in history, the US is going to respond in a way that is muted, and the Europeans are going to be divided, and we have a new German government, and they won't really be able to do much. I think the Russians, in fact, have been surprised by how unified Europe and America have managed to be over sanctions. But would that be the case in another 4 years? Would it be the case if we had another Trump presidency after 2024? I think a lot of what is going on in the context to all of this uncertainty is a sense that the security role that the US has played in the world is going through a major transition, and everyone else needs to change their thinking about the future of their own security and how much they can rely upon themselves. And Europe hasn't been prepared to do it, because for so long it's been able to rely on NATO for the military side and the EU for the economy and soft power side.
Thank you very much, Jane. And please, Ellen.
It's actually interesting. We're having this debate, obviously, about kind of greater EU capacity to act in these regards. I think if you look at obviously the history or recent history, I think you can bookend it with starting with 1991, where we had the Yugoslav crisis, and some of you remember, of course, Jacques Proust saying, "This is the hour of Europe." And of course, it turned out very much not to be the hour of Europe, because the Europeans were not able to solve the Balkan crisis, which ultimately, compared to what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, was a much smaller, if a very complicated sort of set of crises. And I think Europe has struggled to sort of find its role in security policy since that time. And I would end the bookend of that sort of post, Cold War period with the invasion of Ukraine, because suddenly the Europeans overnight have realized that hard power is very much necessary in order to handle security, the security of the continent, let alone anywhere else. I think it's very significant that Germany basically overturned its entire post-war policy on lethal weapons, for example, and indeed now wants to spend its 2% overnight almost. Extraordinary. I don't think the Germans have had the credit for that massive kind of mental shift that took place in a very short period of time to get to that position. And I think if Germany is now thinking in those terms, that may presage a whole new role for the EU internationally. I thought Elmar's point about coalitions of the willing is very interesting. I think that the problem the EU always faces is always a debate about sovereignty versus, supra-sovereign nationalism, the way that, where do you divide the line? It is difficult for countries to give up, if you like, their militaries. It's difficult for them to decide en masse to agree a policy that some of them won't want to agree with. And it's much more difficult, I think, in foreign policy. It can be quite emotive than certain, like tax policy. That's not as dramatic as, would we go to war here, or what is our position on this or that country's views on things. So I think if the EU for it to develop its capacity in this regard, and this might, of course, be reflective of policy in the Middle East as well, it might need to move to a system not of, kind of majority voting where everyone is forced to come along, but majority voting where those who are part of it are able to act rather than not be able to act. And I think that's the best position the EU could be in, because it won't get, you know, kind of unanimity on some of these issues across all its member states. But that shouldn't stop many of the EU countries acting, you know, collectively to make a difference in areas of the world where the EU can. The EU does spend vast amounts of money, obviously, in development and in aid. It does spend vast amounts on defense, but it isn't, as Elmar said, coordinated, which is, you know, kind of limits its ability. I think what we've now realized is that there are real challenges in the 21st century. It's not the end of history. Well, we knew that for some time, I think, but now it's been brought home to us in quite dramatic fashion. And that if we do want to fight for the values of Europe, of the EU and others, we have to, you know, literally be prepared to fight for them. Because if we don't do that, others who have, you know, malign intentions will be able to get their way and impose their sort of position on others. I think you know, it's generally a sad factor that in 2022, that, you know, the free world, as you know, to use that phrase, is shrinking, not growing right now, and that requires all of us who value the free world to work out new ways that we're going to reverse that decline, firstly, and once again, increase the space. And to end on this point, I think the EU historically has had a very good role in democracy promotion, in terms of actually building up the nuts and bolts of these things, working with, you know, kind of movements to deal with how you can help bring people to democracy. I think a more muscular look at that again, now that we've seen how the free world is under pressure, would be a very effective way for where the EU could immediately make its voice heard, because it takes some time to build up your military capabilities.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to touch now on the question of the Gulf region and especially Iran. The first question is, and I would like you to answer the two questions, and they are, do you think that the Gulf region can provide us in the West, and especially with more resources of gas and oil? And the second question is the strategic one. How should we deal with Iran? Should we sanction Iran much more heavily than we did before? So the whole question, what is going on in the Gulf region, and should we talk to dictators? Shouldn't we do it? So maybe you touch now on all these big questions. What should be our mindset concerning the need for major transition towards the Gulf region and especially Iran? Please, Elmar, start.
Thank you. I think in this question, the European Union cannot be a mediator. I believe we are part of the countries who want to avoid war, also in the Middle East. And therefore, we must stand on certain positions with the rest of the world who wants to do so. When we come to Iran, the main point is to avoid the bomb. Simple as that. I was a little bit involved in the agreement with Iran, and it was set up and took part in the negotiations. This was the goal, to avoid the bomb. If the bomb is not avoidable, we will get war. Because there will be countries like Israel, but not only Israel, to stop Iran finally to have a bomb. Because if Iran would have a bomb, that would mean that in the whole Islamic world, in the whole region, Iran would get a dominance. This is not just a question of Israel, at least so much a question of Saudi Arabia, for example, and the allies of Saudi Arabia. And I think if Iran is allowed to have the bomb, then also other countries will look into that. Saudi Arabia wants to have one. Egypt wants to have one. If Iran gets it in that part of the world, you can forget the agreements, the proliferation agreement, and we will have a further development. And that was the big mistake by President Trump to stop that, and short-sighted by Israel to lobby for that. And I do not trust the mullahs very much. I know them partly a little bit, but they have also problems at home. because they cannot feed their people anymore. And here to find the right balance of control, avoiding the bomb might be an important thing, but that does not mean that we accept the military expansion by Iran. We have to see this development where also Russia was helpful, that because of the stupidity of the second Iraq war, the American behavior in Iraq, and afterwards what happened because of that with the Islamic State and so on, that we have now a situation that there is one line from Tehran to Iraq, where we have now a Shiite majority government, Syria, which is very much involved, to Lebanon, which is breaking down at the moment because of the behavior of Hezbollah there. And this line, I think, is of the utmost importance. And I hope that we can make a difference to avoiding the bomb negotiations, which at the moment look that they are on a good track. And at the same time, to fight such a powerful development in the Middle East because of this line Tehran to Beirut.
Thank you, Elmar. Maybe to strengthen this, the question a little bit, it's always the big question, should we isolate Iran, or what should be the behavior of EU, US and Western democracy towards such a dictatorship? Please, Jane, come in with your answer.
Thank you. Well, I agree with Elmar about the importance of making sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. I think what we're seeing now in Europe underlines why that's so important. It's not only about the risk of nuclear war, it's the fact that countries with nuclear weapons can basically use those weapons for political blackmail. They can do things that are well below the nuclear threshold and understand that, you know, the US is not going to come and engage in a direct fight with them because nobody wants a direct fight between nuclear powers. And I think this is what Iran's rivals in the region are particularly worried about, that a nuclear Iran would increase its interventionism through the region, even if it didn't use the nuclear bomb. So that is a priority. And we should also remember that the West has tried isolation and supporting regime change in Iran for 40 years without getting effective results. The sanctions that the EU and US and others have put on have been effective in one case only, which was to secure the JCPOA. And I think it's not possible to do everything at once. If the view was to say we should isolate Iran because it's a dictatorship with a poor human rights record, that would also undermine the nuclear deal without necessarily getting any benefits. There does need to be work to reduce the role of Iranian militias throughout the region, but in each case, they are part of a conflict. It's not a unilateral move by Iran. You know, these militias gain in strength because of political problems and conflicts in each country, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria. You know, so there needs to be work in each of these country contexts to actually ultimately create a well-functioning state. And although the EU doesn't have the hard power, it does have institution building capacity that can help, but it's very long-term work and it takes a lot of patience. Finally, on the oil, a few people have asked about that on the chat. This is a big question where actually the Gulf Arab states are being pushed to do something they're not very comfortable with, because they can, especially Saudi Arabia, increase oil production and help take the economic pressure off oil importers. So far, they haven't done it. At the last OPEC meeting, they decided not to change production. And increasingly, the US and Europe are leaning on them, saying it's vital that you do this to compensate for the oil embargo on Russia. I think in the end, they will probably do something, but you can see that they're not immediately jumping in to support the West. They are trying to hedge their bets.
Okay, thank you, Jane. And now Ellen, please.
Well, just to follow up on that point Jane's made, yes, of course, we could get more oil pumping, obviously, from the Middle East. It would be sort of an immediate way to alleviate some of the problems, but I'm no doubt they're seeing the cash registers ka-ching the whole time right now, and they're going, well, we benefit from oil prices being this high. We're sitting pretty, so let's ride the wave. We've had low oil prices for a while. Now we're going to have high oil prices, and what are they going to do? They're going to have to buy the oil at that price. So this is an example, of course, of kind of the way that resources are distributed around the world and who has got them. But this leads to its ultimate point, which is we need to reduce our dependency on all these sources in the West. The Middle East is no more useful as a source than Russia in this way. It also has its problems of governance, its problems of human rights, its problems, even if you recall, of course, the Iraq-Kuwait war, and in fact the Iran-Iraq war, of neighboring conflicts potentially disrupting supplies. What is clearly the message of the Russia conflict in relation to oil and gas is that we have to either develop renewables as quickly as possible to get out of there, or find our alternative solutions that are not dependent on the whims of despots of various kinds in order to safeguard our national security. So that's that bit. On the Iran sort of question about the deal, look, the original Iran deal was a terrible mistake. Just when Iran was on its knees, essentially economically, with a very concerted sanctions regime around the world, Barack Obama threw them a several $1 billion lifeline in terms of how this could operate. It was a huge mistake. They would have come to the same table and come to the same conclusion without having to give any of this stuff away. And none of the daft sort of clauses in that deal about sunset clauses, about no understanding of the ballistic missile side of things and how this all works. Essentially, that deal was not about stopping Iran's program. It was about pausing Iran's program. And that clearly was not the right track to be taking at the time. And we did have unity, of course, at the time. And let's not forget that there were some European countries who were very resilient in trying to stop the deal from occurring on the terms it did. The French in particular were very strong on this and were told by Obama, I'm signing it anyway. And then, of course, it's compounded by Trump leaving the deal, leaving the Europeans in the deal, meaning we had an ineffective sanctions regime, of course, when the Americans came out. The problem, I fear, though, is that, of course, the Europeans have seen provision after provision of that deal being broken openly by Iran. Every single clause has been broken, and yet they haven't reimposed sanctions. Now, that is frankly a bit pathetic, to be honest. You signed a deal, okay, the Americans walked away, but you have seen how that deal has been torn up by Iran in front of your eyes, and you've done nothing about it. That's weak, and it sends a message to Iran they can get what they want. And no doubt we will hear what happens in Vienna, but they will presumably get what they want in there, because currently the American position on this, frankly, is that they presumably want it off their agenda as much as possible, because they need to focus all their bandwidth on Russia. It's a terrible mistake, because if we do flood Iran with cash again and just pause their program, they are far more advanced now than where they were back in 2016. And it will, you are simply rearming a state who will not use that money to benefit its people, but will instead use it to fund all the foreign terrorist activities that have destabilized the region for the past 2 decades. So it will be a huge own goal to re-sign a deal on the kind of terms that are being mooted. If there is to be a deal, I would prefer it to be on the terms that were mooted in the British Integrated Review, where we were suggesting, for example, that it should be a regional deal involving more than just the nuclear side, because you can't disassociate Iran's nuclear ambitions from its other ambitions in the region. This is not a country where there is some kind of separate policy here. It is all part of the same basket. And if you really want to bring Iran back into the community of nations, it needs to accept that it will not destabilize the region, because anything short of that, and you're just buying further into a problem.
Okay, that is a very tough stand and position on Iran, and your assessment is that this deal is not the right thing. So there we have clear divisions between us, how to deal with that. I would like to touch on another question, because we now said very often that it's about major transitions, it's about the change of political mindset, and things are happening very rapidly. On the other hand, in the European Commission, I would like to ask your assessment, are they ready really to embrace that? And do they have the calculation to ask by polling or referenda, what is the assessment of the European citizens? Because if we really have to be in a different mindset, what is my personal opinion? And I think our think tank has to play a role in all these new orientation debates. The people have to understand what is at stake, and that the world is very different from what they thought the world is or should be. So how do we get a lot of people who are hesitant and reluctant at the moment of this mental shift? How do we get them on board, Elmar? And then please the two others.
Look, at the end should be always discussions, treaties, agreements, and so on. But agreements need preconditions. I will never forget that in 2014, after the Russians took the Crimea and started the war in the Donbass, I was in Texas and was invited by Bush's father to celebrate with him the 25th year of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I asked him, what should we do now? And he said, simple things, and explained it later. He said, to be strong, to show that you're strong, and then talk, talk, talk. And when we look backwards, many of us were angry with Reagan that I was so forceful in his remarks. We had never more disarmament and agreements and as we had in a Reagan-Bush time. Never before, never afterwards. That's true. All the main treaties which are drop out now, INF and everything, was done in that time. And therefore, it's that classical question, when you want to talk to a dictator, the dictator must know that you're strong. Then you have a chance to come to peaceful solutions and have the possibility to come to better relationships. We have always talked to dictators. That is also the reason why we talk to Tehran in these days. Never give up to talk in hope to do something, but prepare for the other story, which is the most convincing part, that peace will not be endangered.
Yeah, thank you, Elmar. Jane, please.
I mean, I think European attitudes will shift as they see war being something that is about potentially fending off aggression, you know, rather than intervening in faraway countries for uncertain outcomes. But the problems are going to come up looking at the fiscal costs, because for all governments, whatever their political orientation, the recent disruptions and crises are all pointing to higher spending. You know, we have the public health, we have the burden of people that have long COVID and COVID complications on the health services right across Europe, kids that need to catch up from school, all of these things. And then on top of it, looks likely that there's going to need to be more defense spending at the same time, and a generation of young people that have seen the state just behaving in a more dramatic way in their lives than their parents ever saw, and will also be expecting more social support, more support with jobs, etc. So I think the fiscal issues, the sovereign debt issues are going to become more and more central in EU politics. Also just want to respond to a couple of the points on the JCPOA, because I think that I don't believe that it is UK policy that there should be a larger deal instead of the JCPOA. The line from the UK leadership and from the FCDO has been consistent to get back into the JCPOA and use that as a building block for a larger regional agreement that clearly is needed. So it's not really a question of whether that's needed, but it's a question of sequencing. I think that while you might not, like Iran or agree with what they do, with the JCPOA, they have behaved quite rationally. They got into a deal, basically, we'll put the nuclear program on hold and adopt the most stringent inspections regime ever seen, which was a very credible inspections regime, in return for sanctions lifting and economic benefits. They stopped getting the economic benefits. It became clear Europe couldn't provide them without the US. And so after about 18 months, they started to go back on their own commitments. They said they were doing it very transparently, but they said, we'll keep doing it until the US comes back in. And it's a great shame that the US did not go back in on day one of Biden coming into power. I think because in Washington, some people thought, let's hold out for a bigger deal. If they'd gone back into the JCPOA at that time, they might have been able to make more progress by now on the missiles and the regional conflicts and other things that need to be done. So I hope they can get on with that overdue work very soon. But it does illustrate that in this, the US has absolute primacy.
Okay, thank you, Jane. And now please, Ellen.
Not to rehash the previous conversation again, but I'm not in agreement with you on where the UK's position was in the integrated review. I do agree that that there have been differing summaries since then, but I'm referring to a very specific point which I feel we should have been addressing, and it would have made more sense for everyone to deal with the regional issues within the framework, because that's where the collective power is. Iran ultimately has shown itself to be a rational actor when confronted with the option of basically losing the regime. What we have to understand is that the Iranians' first priority is to keep their regime going, and we saw this quite clearly when Qasem Soleimani was killed. Okay, the Americans took out the lead terrorist in chief of Iran's infrastructure, one of the closest people to the supreme leader in the regime, and everyone was saying, oh, this will spark war, they will hit you back, etc. And they didn't hit back at all. They plinked a few empty army bases, and we know why they plinked a few army bases. They were told explicitly, you harm one American in response, we will upgrade our capabilities, and it will end ultimately in the tit-for-tat game with you going out of Tehran in coffins. And they listened and took it back. The reality is, Iran has shown time and time again, it is rational, it will listen to pressure, it will listen to the reality. All we have to do is turn up the pressure, not come to some ridiculous agreement with them where we're throwing money into the hands of this odious regime. Instead, we could bring it to its knees, force it to comply, and if it does it in that way, we would be able to handle Iran and bring it back into the international community as a partner rather than its current phrase. Nobody in their wildest dreams would imagine that Iran, post-nuclear deal, would still be any less aggressive, any less meddling, any less manipulative, any less dangerous than it is today under the current regime. And you need to change its behavior full stop, because frankly, it is a rogue state, and it's acted like a rogue state for some time, given its activities in this way. But just to go back to the question that you asked, Helga, I don't have much to add actually from what Elmar and Jane have mentioned. I think people are waking up to the realities. The world has shown them that it is not safe and sensible to not take pay attention to what's going on around you. And as such, I think Europeans are sensible people ultimately, and we all accept that the world changes constantly, and what may have been appropriate in the 1990s and even the 2000s is no longer appropriate in the third decade of the 21st century.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. Now we are more or less coming to the end of our session. Therefore, I would like to ask you two last questions. Please give us a very general view, sentence, or demand, what for you personally is very important in the given moment. And second question, what would you like us as EU Watch to play a role in this debate, new orientation, new positioning So what would you like us to do, and which role and part can EU Watch play in this important global debate and innovation of European politics? Please, Elmar.
First of all, the journey should give a good answer to Mr. Macron, his Sorbonne speech a few years ago. We need, Europe can win its sovereignty, or the European countries can get the sovereignty only back by joining each other in a strong foreign security defense policy. And then combine it with their soft powers and their peaceful goals. That, I think, it's an important question, to see it as one point. Now, here we can make a difference, and we can have a secure situation for us and be helpful for peace in the world. The second point is that we should explain that to our people in a proper way. We have not done so. We have to show all the implications. And the politicians must be also, if it's not popular, to tell these questions to our citizens. What I see now, it's a miracle in Germany, that people now are ready to take higher prices, at least for some time, in energy and other questions, in supporting Ukraine. Is that someone would have told me 2 months ago, I would not have believed it. And sometimes I have the feeling that the citizens are further developed than the politicians, who have less courage than the citizens.
Okay, let's hope so. There are some hints that it's like this. Please, Jane.
Well, I'll go back to a very interesting point that was put in the chat about, the invasion of Ukraine being a violation of the UN Charter, and NATO shouldn't just be about defending NATO members. What can the EU do for countries that aren't membership? Is it going to be simply, we will promise Ukraine might get accession, but actually this is going to rumble on for years and never make any progress? This has become a problem also in the Balkans. The EU's primary route seems to be accession talks, but actually the appetite for expansion also seems to be very limited. So what are the other arrangements that the EU can make with neighbours that does afford them protection and support and greater prosperity, rather than making very distant promises that for some don't really have the credibility that they used to have?
Okay, thank you. Ellen, please.
Yes, I think just to follow up on those two comments on meld the two, I think actually, yes, the EU has played a tremendous role in the last 30 years of, if you like, expanding the space of the free world, building institutions, helping develop its neighboring regions. But it is correct, I think, to say that it's kind of come, that sort of drive has come to a halt. And clearly that something needs to now work within the EU mindset to go, look, how are we going to reignite, if you like, this sort of long-standing policy of ours to be effective and help steer those on our borders to better end points, basically. So it probably does need a new neighborhood policy, essentially, which may not hold out the prospect of full membership of the EU, but some kind of associate membership or some area where it can actually lead in this regard. And when it comes again to the military and the sort of foreign and military policy, security policy, I do think leadership is what matters here. Elmar's quite right to say this is about European leaders explaining finally to their populations why this is important and making that case. And these things can shift things, but it does rely on leaders being bold and brave and going out there, making the case. And again, we've seen this many times in the past, when you have what at first seems to be an unpopular policy, or a policy that would appear to be at odds with what's happened before. If leaders make a concerted effort to make that difference, you will end up with a transformation in your policy, because people are very open to reason, even in today's world of fake news and kind of strong opinions. Reason and fact eventually do win through.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would really like to thank you for giving us the possibility to talk to you, to listen to you. I think we have some very important findings. We all realize now that enemies do exist and that we have to deal with them and that we cannot be so weak as we have been before. So what Emma said, be strong, show your strength, and then talk. What the older Bush already said. And of course, it's very much about good leadership. We have to be courageous and we want to be good leaders, otherwise we will fail. And we have to explain to our people. That I think is really very important, that people do understand that we have to act, why we have to act, and that we want to defend our values, our democracies, and that there is a lot at stake when we have a look at the dictators all around. And therefore, yes, we have to invest in these debates, in these new orientation, in innovation of ourselves. So EU Watch will continue to play this role and to invite very important people like you today. So thank you to all our listeners and to the people who prepared this session. I wish you a good day and thank you very much. Hopefully I see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.